The ballroom fell silent the moment Duke Alexander Whitmore raised his glass and spoke the words that every woman in the room would repeat for weeks. "I never chase anyone," he said, his voice calm and certain, as though he were commenting on the weather rather than making a declaration that would soon be tested by fate itself. The men around him laughed and lifted their own glasses in agreement, while the women exchanged glances that mixed admiration with quiet resentment. None of them knew that within the hour, a stranger would walk into his life and undo every certainty he had just spoken aloud. Eleanor Hartley stood near the edge of the ballroom, far from the cluster of nobles who orbited around Alexander like moths drawn to a flame they pretended not to need. She had not wanted to attend this gathering. Her aunt had insisted, reminding her that opportunities like this did not come twice for a merchant's daughter suddenly welcomed into circles she had never asked to enter. Eleanor wore a simple gown of pale blue, elegant but without the extravagant jewels that sparkled on every other woman present. She did not need them. Her posture alone carried a quiet authority that made people glance twice, uncertain why a woman with no title commanded such attention. Alexander noticed her before he understood why. She was not the most striking woman in the room by conventional standards, yet something about the way she held herself, untouched by the performance around her, caught his eye and refused to let go. He watched her decline an invitation to dance from a young baron with practiced ease, offering a polite smile that carried no warmth and no apology. The baron retreated, embarrassed, while Eleanor returned to her quiet observation of the crowd as though nothing had happened. Curiosity pulled Alexander across the room before he had fully decided to move. He approached her with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own charm, extending a slight bow that most women would have met with a blush or a flutter of nervous laughter. Eleanor offered neither. She studied him for a moment, taking in the fine cut of his coat and the practiced ease of his smile, and said nothing at all until he introduced himself. "Duke Alexander Whitmore," he said, watching for the recognition that always followed his name. "Eleanor Hartley," she replied, offering no title because she had none to give, and no visible reaction to his either. He asked if she was enjoying the evening. She answered honestly that she found most of these evenings tedious, filled with people who spoke a great deal and said very little of substance. Alexander laughed, genuinely surprised, because no one spoke to him that way, certainly not within the first minute of meeting him. He asked what she would rather be doing instead of standing in a ballroom surrounded by tedious people. She told him she would rather be reading, or walking somewhere quiet, or doing almost anything that did not require pretending to be impressed by wealth she had not earned and titles she did not covet. There was no flirtation in her tone, no calculated pause designed to draw him closer. She spoke as though she were simply passing the time until she could leave, which unsettled Alexander more than any calculated seduction could have. He was used to women who leaned closer when he spoke, who laughed a fraction too loudly at his jokes, who found reasons to touch his sleeve or ask about his estates. Eleanor did none of these things. She answered his questions with brief, direct honesty and asked nothing about his fortune or his properties at all. He tried a different approach, complimenting her gown, her composure, the sharpness of her observations. She thanked him politely for each remark but did not soften toward him the way he expected. When the orchestra began a new song, he asked if she would honor him with a dance. She considered the request for a moment, glanced toward the dance floor where couples were already assembling, and declined. "I am afraid I do not dance with strangers," she said, though her tone held no real fear at all, only a calm and settled certainty. "We are no longer strangers," Alexander pointed out. "You know my name and I know yours." "Names are easy to learn," Eleanor replied. "They tell me very little about a person's character." Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that he could not immediately name. No one had ever refused him so plainly, without cruelty, but also without the slightest interest in softening the blow. He found himself wanting to prove something to her, though he could not say exactly what. He asked if he might call on her family sometime soon, a request that would have thrilled most women in the room and secured their favor for months. Eleanor considered this too, weighing it with the same careful thought she gave every question. She told him that she saw no reason for a duke to call upon a merchant's daughter, since their paths would likely never cross again beyond tonight's gathering. Her words were not bitter, only practical, as though she had already resigned herself to a world that kept people like her and people like him firmly separated. Before Alexander could respond, an older woman appeared at Eleanor's side, her aunt by the resemblance in their features, and gently reminded her that they were expected elsewhere. Eleanor nodded, offered Alexander a polite farewell that carried none of the weight he suddenly wished it did, and turned to leave. Alexander stood rooted in place, watching her walk away through the crowd without a single backward glance. Other women glanced back. They always did, hoping to catch his eye once more, hoping for a lingering look that promised future attention. Eleanor did not turn around even once. She simply walked toward the door, her posture as composed as it had been the moment he first noticed her, and disappeared into the night as though their conversation had meant nothing at all. His friend Charles Ellery appeared at his elbow moments later, grinning in a way that suggested he had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance. "So the great Duke who never chases anyone has finally met someone worth chasing," Charles said, unable to hide his amusement. Alexander scoffed, though the sound lacked its usual conviction. "I am not chasing her," he said. "I was simply curious about a woman who seemed immune to the usual games played in rooms like this one." Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Curious enough to ask for a dance, curious enough to request calling upon her family," he said. "That sounds like the beginning of a chase to me, my friend, whether you wish to call it that or not." Alexander did not answer. He turned back toward the door through which Eleanor had disappeared, half expecting, absurdly, that she might return. She did not. The orchestra continued playing, the guests continued their idle chatter, and the evening carried on as though nothing significant had occurred. Yet Alexander found himself distracted for the remainder of the night, replaying their brief conversation in his mind, searching for some detail he had missed, some reason her indifference had struck him so deeply when the admiration of countless other women had left him entirely unmoved. He excused himself earlier than usual, declining an invitation to continue the evening at a private card game that he would ordinarily have attended without hesitation. His carriage rattled through the dark streets toward his estate, and he stared out the window without truly seeing the passing lights of the city. He thought of her steady voice, the calm way she had dismissed his title as though it carried no particular weight, and the quiet confidence with which she had walked away without once looking back. By the time he reached his estate, Alexander had convinced himself that his interest in Eleanor Hartley was nothing more than passing curiosity, the natural reaction of a man unaccustomed to rejection. He told himself he would forget her name by morning, that she was simply an unusual woman he would likely never encounter again given the vast difference in their circumstances. He repeated this to himself as he prepared for bed, and again as he lay awake staring at the ceiling long after the rest of the household had fallen asleep. Yet sleep did not come easily that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her walking away, unhurried and unbothered, leaving him with the strange and uncomfortable sensation of having lost something he had never actually possessed. He had spoken the words himself only hours earlier, certain and proud, declaring to everyone within earshot that he never chased anyone. Now those words echoed back at him with an irony he was only beginning to understand, because for the first time in his life, Alexander Whitmore found himself wanting exactly what he had sworn he would never pursue. Morning arrived, and with it came a restlessness that no amount of routine could settle. He rode his horse through the estate grounds earlier than usual, hoping the exertion might clear his mind, yet found himself distracted at every turn by fragments of the previous night's conversation. He thought of asking his staff to inquire about the Hartley family, then dismissed the idea as beneath his dignity, then reconsidered it again within the same hour. By midday, he had changed his mind more times than he cared to admit, torn between the pride that told him to forget her entirely and the persistent curiosity that refused to let her go. He did not yet understand that this restlessness was only the beginning, the first small crack in a certainty he had carried his entire adult life. Eleanor Hartley had walked away without a second glance, and in doing so, she had left behind a question that Alexander could not answer and could not ignore. Somewhere across the city, in a modest home far removed from his grand estate, Eleanor thought of him only briefly before returning to her book, entirely unaware that she had already changed the course of his life in ways neither of them could yet predict. Eleanor's Aunt Margaret had watched the entire exchange with a knowing look, and once they were settled in their carriage, she could not resist a small smile. "That was Duke Whitmore you were speaking with," she said, as though Eleanor might not have understood the significance. Every mother in that room would have given a fortune for her daughter to catch his attention for even a moment, and you walked away as though he were a clerk asking for directions. Eleanor shrugged lightly, watching the city lights pass outside the window. "He was pleasant enough," she admitted, "but pleasant company does not interest me the way it seems to interest everyone else in that room. Titles do not impress me, Aunt Margaret. I have seen what happens to women who mistake a handsome face and a grand name for genuine affection." Margaret's expression softened, understanding the reference to her niece's late sister, without either of them needing to speak the name aloud. "Not every man is the same, my dear," she said gently. "Perhaps in time you will find one worth trusting." Eleanor did not answer, choosing instead to watch the darkened streets roll past, her mind already drifting away from the ballroom, and the Duke who had seemed so certain of himself, so unaccustomed to being told no. She did not know that he was, at that very moment, standing at his own window across the city, equally unable to stop thinking of her. 3 days had passed since the ball, and Alexander Whitmore still could not shake the memory of a woman who had walked away without a single glance back. He sat in his study surrounded by unopened correspondence, staring at the same page of a ledger he had failed to read for the better part of an hour. His steward, a patient man named Edmund Carter, cleared his throat twice before Alexander finally looked up. "Your Grace," Edmund said carefully, "the matter of the tenant leases requires your signature before the end of the week." Alexander nodded absently, signed where indicated, and returned to his thoughts without offering the usual conversation that typically accompanied their business meetings. Edmund studied him for a moment longer than necessary before excusing himself, sensing that something had changed in his employer that he could not quite name. Alexander told himself repeatedly that his distraction had nothing to do with Eleanor Hartley. He reminded himself of her modest circumstances, her complete lack of interest in his title, and the fact that pursuing her would accomplish nothing beyond scandal and inconvenience. Yet every argument he constructed against thinking of her dissolved the moment he tried to focus on anything else. By the 4th day, he had made a decision he would not have admitted to anyone, least of all himself. He would attend Lady Ashford's garden party that weekend, an event he had originally intended to skip purely because he had learned through casual inquiry that the Hartley family had also received an invitation. He did not tell himself this was chasing her. He told himself it was simple curiosity, an opportunity to understand why a woman with no title and no fortune had managed to unsettle him so completely in the span of a single conversation. Charles Ellery, upon learning of his sudden interest in attending, made no attempt to hide his amusement. "I thought you found garden parties unbearably dull," Charles said, leaning against the doorway of Alexander's study with a knowing grin. "Yet here you are, suddenly eager to spend an afternoon admiring flowers and drinking lukewarm tea." Alexander did not look up from his desk. "Lady Ashford's gardens are said to be remarkable this time of year," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I thought a change of scenery might do me good." Charles laughed outright at that, the sound echoing through the study. "A change of scenery," he repeated. "Yes, I am certain that is precisely why the great Duke Whitmore, who never chases anyone, has suddenly developed such enthusiasm for flowers." Alexander shot him a warning look, but Charles only raised his hands in mock surrender, still grinning as he left the room. The day of the garden party arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of roses across Lady Ashford's expansive grounds. Alexander arrived fashionably late, as was his habit, and immediately scanned the crowd of guests scattered across the lawn beneath colorful awnings. He spotted Eleanor near a row of blooming hedges, engaged in conversation with 2 other young women who seemed far more animated than she did. He approached slowly, careful not to appear as eager as he felt, and waited for a natural pause in the conversation before making his presence known. Eleanor turned at the sound of her name being mentioned by one of her companions, and her expression shifted only slightly upon recognizing him, a polite acknowledgement rather than the flustered surprise he had half expected. "Duke Whitmore," she said, offering a brief curtsy that matched the formality of their first meeting rather than any warmth that might have grown between them since. "I did not expect to see you here." "Lady Ashford's gardens are famous throughout the county," Alexander replied, repeating the excuse he had given Charles days earlier. "I thought I would see them for myself." Eleanor's companions exchanged a quick glance, clearly recognizing the significance of a duke seeking out their friend, but Eleanor herself showed no such reaction. She simply nodded and gestured toward the roses beside her. "They are certainly beautiful," she agreed. "Lady Ashford has quite a talent for cultivation." The conversation that followed was polite but distant, nothing like the sharp, honest exchange they had shared at the ball. Eleanor answered his questions courteously, asked a few of her own out of simple politeness, and made no effort to extend their interaction beyond what basic manners required. Alexander found himself growing increasingly frustrated, though he tried not to let it show. He had expected, perhaps foolishly, that a second meeting might reveal more of the woman who had captured his attention so completely, yet she remained as guarded and composed as ever, treating him with the same careful neutrality she likely extended to every guest at the party. He tried a different approach, asking about her interests beyond the obligations of society gatherings. Eleanor mentioned, briefly, that she enjoyed reading histories and occasionally attempted to sketch the gardens she visited, though she insisted her skills were modest at best. Alexander seized on this small opening, asking to see her sketches, offering genuine interest rather than the practiced flattery he typically employed with women in her position. Eleanor hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to anyone showing real curiosity about her personal pursuits rather than her availability or her connections. She finally admitted that she had brought her sketchbook, as she often did to garden parties where the scenery provided pleasant subjects, and reluctantly agreed to show him a few pages when her companions wandered off to sample the refreshments being served nearby. The sketches were simple but skillfully rendered, capturing the delicate shapes of flowers and the play of light through garden trellises with an attention to detail that surprised him. Alexander studied each page carefully, offering genuine compliments rather than empty praise, and for the first time since their initial meeting, he saw something shift in Eleanor's expression, a small crack in her careful composure. "You have a good eye," he said honestly. "This is not the work of someone who considers her skills modest." Eleanor accepted the compliment with less resistance than he expected, a faint smile touching her lips before she caught herself and closed the sketchbook. "I enjoy it," she admitted. "It gives me something quiet to do while everyone else discusses matters I find rather tedious." Alexander smiled at the familiar echo of her words from the ball. "You did tell me you found most gatherings tedious," he reminded her. "I am pleased to see your opinion has not changed in the days since we met." Eleanor's smile widened slightly before fading into something more guarded. "Duke Whitmore," she said carefully, "may I ask why you have sought me out again? I am aware that men of your position do not typically pursue conversations with women of mine unless they want something specific, and I would rather understand your intentions plainly than guess at them." Her directness caught him off guard, though he supposed he should have expected nothing less from her. He considered his answer carefully before speaking, aware that a careless response might close whatever small opening had appeared between them. "I am not entirely certain myself," he admitted, which was more honest than anything he had said to a woman in years. "You left an impression on me that I have not been able to shake, and I find myself curious to understand why." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing his words with the same careful consideration she seemed to apply to everything. "Curiosity fades quickly," she said finally. "I would advise you not to invest too much time in satisfying it, Your Grace, before it leads you somewhere you did not intend to go." Before Alexander could respond, her companions returned with plates of small pastries, drawing Eleanor back into a lighter conversation that excluded him from its casual rhythm. He remained nearby for a while longer, listening more than speaking, observing the way Eleanor interacted with people she trusted, noting the difference between her guarded manner with him and her genuine warmth toward her friends. It only deepened his fascination, though he recognized the danger in that fascination even as it grew. Charles found him later, standing alone near the edge of the garden, watching Eleanor's retreating figure as she and her companions moved toward the house for refreshments. "You have been staring at that woman for the better part of an hour," Charles observed, his tone lacking its earlier teasing edge, replaced instead by genuine curiosity. "This is not like you, Alexander. I have never seen you pursue anyone with such persistence, certainly not someone who shows so little interest in return." Alexander did not deny it this time. "I do not fully understand it myself," he admitted quietly. "There is something about her honesty that I find impossible to ignore. Every other woman in society tells me what she thinks I want to hear. Eleanor tells me exactly what she thinks, regardless of how it might be received." Charles studied his friend for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that is precisely why you cannot stop thinking of her," he said. "You have spent your entire life surrounded by flattery. Honesty must feel like something entirely new." The observation struck Alexander with unexpected force, settling into his thoughts as he made his way home that evening. He turned Charles's words over in his mind, examining them from every angle, and found he could not disagree. Eleanor Hartley offered him nothing that he had not already possessed in abundance. No flattery, no admiration, no eager pursuit of his attention. Instead, she offered something rarer and far more valuable, an honesty that forced him to see himself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. That night, as he prepared for bed, Alexander found himself thinking not of pursuit or conquest, but of understanding. He wanted to know what had made Eleanor so guarded, what experience had taught her to distrust men of his position so thoroughly. He resolved that he would find a way to earn her trust properly, without the games and performances that typically characterized his interactions with women in society. It would require patience, a quality he had rarely needed to exercise in his privileged life, but for reasons he still did not fully understand, he found himself willing to try. Across the city, Eleanor sat by her window long after her aunt had retired for the night, her sketchbook open on her lap though she made no move to draw. She thought of the Duke's genuine interest in her small drawings, the way he had listened rather than merely waited for his turn to speak, and the honesty in his admission that he did not fully understand his own curiosity about her. It troubled her more than she wanted to admit, because for the first time since her sister's heartbreak had taught her to guard herself so carefully, she found herself wondering whether this particular man might actually be different from the others. She closed her sketchbook firmly, setting it aside as though the action might also set aside her thoughts, and told herself that such wondering was dangerous. She had built her defenses for good reason, and she would not dismantle them simply because a duke had shown a moment of unexpected sincerity at a garden party. Yet even as she extinguished her candle and settled into bed, the memory of his genuine smile lingered in her mind, refusing to be dismissed as easily as she wished it would. The following morning, Eleanor's Aunt Margaret noticed her niece's distracted mood over breakfast, the untouched tea growing cold in its cup while Eleanor stared out toward the small garden behind their house. "You have hardly said a word this morning," Margaret observed gently, setting down her own cup. "Did something happen at Lady Ashford's party that you have not told me?" Eleanor hesitated before answering, unsure how much she wished to reveal even to her aunt. "Duke Whitmore was there," she admitted finally. "He sought me out again, and asked to see my sketches." Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest, though she kept her tone carefully measured, aware of her niece's guarded nature. "And what did you think of that?" "I do not know what to think," Eleanor confessed, twisting the edge of her napkin between her fingers. "He seemed genuinely interested, not merely polite. It is unsettling, because I have spent so long expecting men of his kind to behave a certain way, and he does not seem to fit that expectation as neatly as I would like." Margaret reached across the table and covered her niece's hand with her own, her expression softening with the memory of old grief they rarely spoke of directly. "Your sister trusted a man who never once looked beneath the surface of things," she said quietly. "He wanted what pleased him and discarded what became inconvenient. If this duke is asking to see your sketches and genuinely listening to your thoughts, perhaps that is worth paying attention to, rather than dismissing out of fear alone." Eleanor considered her aunt's words carefully, though she did not respond immediately. She had built her caution over years, watching her sister's bright optimism crumble into quiet despair after a nobleman's attention had proven to be nothing more than a passing amusement. The lesson had settled deep into her, shaping every interaction she had with men of standing since. Yet some small part of her, the part that had shown Alexander her sketchbook despite every instinct urging caution, wondered if her aunt might be right. "I am not ready to trust him," Eleanor said finally, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "But I suppose there is no harm in observing him a little longer before I decide anything at all." Margaret smiled, satisfied with this small concession, and returned to her breakfast without pressing the matter further. She had learned long ago that her niece required patience rather than persuasion, and she trusted that Eleanor would find her own way toward whatever conclusion suited her best. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander spent the following days occupied with matters of his estate, yet found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the garden party and the brief glimpse of warmth Eleanor had allowed him to see. He mentioned nothing of this to his family, aware that his mother in particular would have strong opinions about a duke pursuing a merchant's daughter, regardless of how genuine his interest might be. He kept his growing fascination private, sharing only fragments with Charles, who remained the sole witness to how thoroughly Eleanor Hartley had disrupted his carefully ordered life. He began making inquiries, carefully and discreetly, about the Hartley family's circumstances, learning that Eleanor's father managed a modest but respectable trading business, and that the family had only recently gained entry into society through a distant connection to Lady Ashford. He learned also, through careful and gentle questioning, fragments of the story regarding Eleanor's sister, though the details remained frustratingly incomplete. What he did understand was enough to explain her caution, and rather than discouraging him, it only deepened his resolve to prove himself different from whatever man had caused her family such grief. By the end of the week, Alexander had resolved to find a proper occasion to see Eleanor again, one that would allow for genuine conversation rather than the brief, interrupted exchanges that social gatherings typically permitted. He did not yet know how such an opportunity might arise, but he found himself watching the invitations that arrived at his estate with unusual attention, searching for any event that might bring them together once more. Lady Ashford's invitation to a formal dinner arrived at Alexander's estate on a Tuesday morning, and he read it twice before allowing himself to feel any hope. The guest list, included as a courtesy for a gathering of such significance, confirmed what he had been waiting to learn. The Hartley family had been invited, likely due to the same connection that had secured their place at the garden party weeks earlier. Alexander accepted the invitation immediately, an unusual eagerness that did not go unnoticed by his household staff. The evening of the dinner arrived with a light rain that gave the city streets a polished, glimmering quality beneath the lamplight. Alexander arrived early, a habit so foreign to his usual conduct that Lady Ashford herself remarked upon it with visible surprise when she greeted him at the door. He offered a vague explanation about wishing to avoid the worst of the rain, though his true purpose was to secure a favorable position before the seating arrangements were finalized. His efforts proved unnecessary, as Lady Ashford, ever perceptive about the currents moving beneath her social gatherings, had already arranged for Eleanor to be seated near him at the long dining table, perhaps sensing an opportunity that amused her more than it concerned her. When Eleanor arrived with her family and discovered the arrangement, she cast a brief, questioning glance toward her aunt, who only offered an innocent shrug in return, though the slight curve of her lips suggested she was not entirely surprised. The dinner began with the usual formalities, introductions and pleasantries exchanged across the long table as servants moved efficiently between courses. Alexander found himself seated close enough to Eleanor that their conversation could remain private amid the general chatter of the other guests, and he made a deliberate effort to keep his tone light, avoiding the intensity that had perhaps unsettled her at the garden party. "I understand you enjoy reading histories," he said, recalling the small details she had shared weeks earlier. "I recently finished an account of the northern campaigns that I found rather compelling, if you are interested in such things." Eleanor's expression shifted with genuine surprise, clearly not expecting him to have remembered such a minor detail from their previous conversation. "I do enjoy histories," she confirmed, "though I confess I find myself more drawn to accounts of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances than to the grand campaigns of kings and generals." "That is an interesting distinction," Alexander replied, genuinely curious. "What draws you to those particular stories?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, as she seemed to consider most things. "I suppose I find more truth in them," she said. "Kings and generals often have their stories written to serve a particular purpose, to glorify or justify their actions. Ordinary people rarely have such motives. Their stories tend to be more honest, even when they are less impressive." Alexander found himself nodding, struck by the thoughtfulness of her answer. "That honesty seems to matter a great deal to you," he observed. "You mentioned something similar during our first conversation, about preferring substance over performance." Eleanor met his gaze directly, her expression more open than he had seen it since their initial meeting at the ball. "It matters a great deal," she confirmed, "perhaps more than it should, given how rarely I encounter it in circles like this one." Their conversation continued through several courses, ranging across topics that revealed more of Eleanor's character than Alexander had managed to uncover in their previous encounters. She spoke of her father's trading business with evident pride, describing the careful work required to build relationships with merchants across distant ports, work that required patience and integrity rather than mere charm. She spoke of her mother, who had passed several years earlier, with a tenderness that softened her usually composed features. She spoke of books she had read and places she hoped one day to visit, though she added, almost as an afterthought, that such hopes seemed unlikely given her family's modest circumstances. Alexander listened more than he spoke, offering occasional observations but mostly allowing Eleanor the space to share herself freely, a rare occurrence for a woman who typically guarded her thoughts so carefully. He found himself increasingly aware of how different this conversation felt from every other exchange he had shared with women in society. Conversations that typically revolved around his own accomplishments and possessions, rather than any genuine exchange of ideas. As the final course was cleared, and the guests began to rise for after-dinner conversation in the drawing room, Alexander seized a brief moment of privacy to ask a question that had been forming in his mind throughout the evening. "You mentioned once that you have seen what happens to women who mistake wealth and status for genuine affection," he said carefully, choosing his words with unusual deliberation. "Might I ask what happened, if you are willing to share it?" Eleanor's expression closed slightly, the openness of moments earlier retreating behind familiar caution. "It is not a pleasant story," she said quietly. "I understand if you would rather not speak of it," Alexander replied gently. "I only ask because I would like to understand you better, not because I wish to cause you pain by revisiting difficult memories." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing whether his sincerity matched his words. Finally she nodded, drawing a slow breath before beginning. "My sister Charlotte was 2 years older than me," she said. "She was bright and hopeful in a way I have never quite managed to be, full of dreams about the future and certain that good things awaited her if only she believed in them strongly enough. She met a nobleman at a gathering much like this one, several years ago," Eleanor continued. her voice steady despite the evident weight of the memory. He courted her attentively for months, promising a future together, speaking of marriage and a life that would elevate our family's circumstances considerably. Charlotte fell completely in love with him, believing every word he offered. Alexander remained silent, sensing that Eleanor needed to tell this story at her own pace, without interruption. When his family discovered the depth of his attachment to her, Eleanor continued, they made it clear that marriage to a merchant's daughter would never be acceptable, regardless of how genuinely he claimed to care for her. He chose his family's approval over his promises to Charlotte, abandoning her without warning or explanation. She learned of his engagement to a woman of proper standing through gossip at another social gathering, rather than from any word from him directly. Her voice caught slightly on the final words, and Alexander felt an unexpected surge of anger toward a man he had never met, on behalf of a woman he had never known. Charlotte was never the same afterward, Eleanor said quietly. The bright hope that had defined her simply faded, replaced by a quiet sadness that never fully lifted. She passed away 2 years later, officially from a lingering illness, though I have always believed her heart simply gave out from the weight of that betrayal. I was only 16 when it happened, but I promised myself I would never allow any man to make me believe in a future he had no intention of honoring. Alexander sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the full weight of her story, and understanding, finally, the depth of caution that guarded every interaction she had with him. I am deeply sorry for your loss, he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even himself, and I understand now why my attention might feel like a threat rather than a compliment. Eleanor's eyes met his, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, any hint that his sympathy was merely performance. Finding none, she allowed a small, sad smile to touch her lips. I appreciate your understanding, she said, but you must also understand why I cannot simply set aside years of caution because a duke has shown interest in my sketches and asked thoughtful questions over dinner. My caution has kept me safe, and I am not willing to abandon it easily. I would never ask you to abandon it easily, Alexander replied firmly. I would only ask that you allow me the opportunity to prove, over time, that I am not the man who broke your sister's heart. I cannot undo what happened to her, but I can show you, through my actions rather than my words, that not every man of standing views women like yourself as disposable amusements. Eleanor did not answer immediately, considering his words with the same careful thought she gave everything. Actions take time to prove themselves, she said finally. Words come easily to men like you, Your Grace. I have learned to trust actions far more than promises. Then I will simply have to be patient, Alexander said, a quiet resolve settling into his voice that Eleanor had not heard from him before. I have never had reason to practice patience in matters of the heart, having never encountered a woman who required it, but I find myself willing to learn, for reasons I am still working to fully understand myself. The other guests began drifting toward the drawing room, and their private conversation drew naturally to a close as Eleanor's aunt approached to collect her for the remainder of the evening's festivities. Before she departed, Eleanor paused, glancing back at Alexander with an expression that held more warmth than caution, for the first time since they had met. Thank you for listening, she said quietly. Most people, upon hearing that story, offer only sympathy without truly understanding why it matters so deeply to how I approach the world. You seem to actually understand. I am trying to, Alexander replied honestly. And I intend to keep trying, if you will permit me the chance. Eleanor did not answer directly, offering only a small nod before following her aunt toward the drawing room, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts amid the fading sounds of dinner guests moving through the house. He remained at the table a moment longer than necessary, replaying every detail of their conversation, understanding now with far greater clarity the depth of what he was asking of her, and the significance of the trust he hoped, eventually, to earn. Later that evening, as his carriage carried him home through streets slick with rain, Alexander found himself reflecting not on his own desires or curiosities, but on Charlotte Hartley, a woman he had never met, whose heartbreak had shaped the caution of the woman who now occupied his every thought. He resolved, with a seriousness that surprised him, that whatever happened between himself and Eleanor, he would never allow his own family's expectations or society's judgments to dictate his treatment of her, as had been done to her sister. The resolution settled into him with unexpected weight, marking a shift in how he understood not only Eleanor but himself, and the kind of man he wished to become in pursuit of her trust. In the drawing room, Eleanor found herself seated near a group of women discussing the latest fashions arriving from the continent, though her attention remained only half engaged with their conversation. Charles Ellery, who had observed the entire dinner exchange between Alexander and Eleanor from a respectful distance, took the opportunity to approach her once the group dispersed toward the card tables. "Miss Hartley," he said, offering a polite bow. "I hope you will forgive my boldness, but I could not help noticing the length of your conversation with my friend this evening. He does not often engage so fully with anyone at these gatherings." Eleanor regarded him with polite curiosity, uncertain of his intentions. "Duke Whitmore is an interesting conversationalist," she replied carefully, neither confirming nor denying the significance Charles seemed to be suggesting. Charles smiled, clearly amused by her careful diplomacy. "I have known Alexander for many years," he said. "I have watched countless women attempt to capture his attention through every manner of charm and flattery imaginable, and I have watched him remain entirely unmoved by all of it. Yet here he sits, quieter and more thoughtful than I have seen him in a great while, and I suspect you are the reason." "I have done nothing to earn such attention," Eleanor said, though her tone carried less certainty than her words suggested. "I have, if anything, discouraged it at every opportunity. Perhaps that is precisely why it has taken root so deeply," Charles replied with a knowing look. "Alexander has spent his entire life surrounded by people eager for his favor. I imagine your reluctance is rather unfamiliar territory for him, and rarer things tend to hold greater fascination." Eleanor considered his words carefully, uncertain how to respond to such an observation from a man she barely knew. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Ellery," she said finally, "but I hope you understand that I have reasons for my caution that extend beyond simple reluctance for its own sake. I am not playing a game designed to increase his interest." Charles's expression softened, any trace of teasing fading into genuine sincerity. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise," he said. "I only wished you to understand that his interest, whatever its cause, appears genuine to me, and I have rarely seen him behave with such sincerity toward anyone. I offer this observation not to pressure you, but simply because I thought you should know it, coming from someone who has known him far longer than you have." Eleanor thanked him for his honesty, though she remained thoughtful for the remainder of the evening, turning his words over in her mind alongside everything Alexander himself had said and done. When her aunt eventually signaled that it was time to depart, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar reluctance to leave, a sensation she quickly suppressed as they made their way toward the waiting carriage. The ride home passed mostly in silence, Eleanor lost in thought as the carriage wheels clattered over wet cobblestones. Margaret watched her niece with quiet interest, sensing that something had shifted during the evening's events, though she chose not to press for details immediately. It was only as they approached their modest home that Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quiet in the darkened carriage. "He asked about Charlotte," she said simply. Margaret's expression grew solemn. "And what did you tell him?" "Everything," Eleanor admitted. "I do not know why I told him everything, Aunt Margaret. I have never spoken of it so completely, not even to my closest friends. There was something in the way he listened that made it feel safe to share, though I cannot fully explain why." Margaret reached over and took her niece's hand gently, perhaps because he listened without trying to fix it, or dismiss it, or turn the conversation back toward himself, she suggested. "That is a rare quality in anyone, Eleanor, let alone a man of his standing." Eleanor nodded slowly, staring out at the rain-slicked streets as they passed. "I told him I would not simply forget my caution because he showed kindness during one dinner conversation," she said. "And I meant it. But I also find myself curious now, in a way I did not expect to feel again after everything that happened to Charlotte." "Curiosity is not a betrayal of your sister's memory," Margaret said gently. "It does not mean you have forgotten the lesson her story taught you. It simply means you remain open to the possibility that not every story must end the same way." Eleanor did not respond immediately, considering her aunt's words as the carriage rolled to a stop outside their home. As she prepared for bed that night, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the conversation at dinner, to the genuine sorrow in Alexander's eyes when she spoke of Charlotte, and to Charles Ellery's assertion that such sincerity was rare from a man who had spent his life surrounded by empty flattery. She did not know what to make of these feelings, unfamiliar as they were after years of careful guardedness, but she allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to consider that perhaps not every man who wore a title carried the same capacity for betrayal that had destroyed her sister's happiness. She fell asleep with her sketchbook still open on her nightstand, a half-finished drawing of the dinner table visible in the candlelight, though she had not consciously intended to capture the memory of that evening at all. A sharp knock at the door pulled Eleanor's father, Walter Hartley, away from his ledgers on a gray afternoon that would soon turn their household upside down. He opened it to find his brother-in-law, Gerald Finch, standing on the step with an expression that mixed forced cheerfulness with something harder underneath. Gerald had managed the family's shipping interests for years, and his visits rarely brought good news. "Walter," Gerald said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "we need to speak about the Calloway debt immediately. The creditors are losing patience, and I have found a solution that will resolve everything before it becomes a public embarrassment for this family." Eleanor, who had been reading in the adjoining room, set down her book and listened carefully through the partially open door. She had known vaguely that her father's business had suffered setbacks after a shipment was lost at sea months earlier, but she had not realized the situation had grown so dire that Gerald felt compelled to intervene so urgently. Walter's voice carried a note of exhaustion as he responded. "What solution do you propose, Gerald? I have already exhausted every reasonable avenue for securing additional credit." Gerald lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent Eleanor from hearing his next words clearly. "Lord Ashworth has expressed interest in Eleanor," he said. "He is wealthy enough to settle the entire debt without hesitation, and a marriage connection would secure this family's future for generations. I have already made preliminary inquiries, and he seems quite favorable to the arrangement." Eleanor's blood ran cold at the mention of Lord Ashworth, a man whose reputation for cruelty toward his household staff and previous acquaintances had reached even her limited circle of society gossip. She had heard whispered accounts of servants dismissed without cause, of a first engagement broken under mysterious and troubling circumstances, and of a temper that turned vicious when crossed. The idea of being bound to such a man, sold essentially to settle a debt, sent a wave of nausea through her. She stepped fully into the room before her father could respond, unable to remain silent while her future was being negotiated without her knowledge. "I will not marry Lord Ashworth," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. Both men turned toward her, Gerald's expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "This is not a matter for you to decide alone, Eleanor," he said sharply. "Your family's future depends on practical solutions, not romantic notions about choosing your own path. Lord Ashworth's proposal would save us all from ruin." "I would rather face ruin honestly than marry a man known for his cruelty," Eleanor replied, refusing to back down despite the anger rising in her uncle's face. "There must be another solution, Father. Please, do not agree to this without considering what it would truly cost me." Walter looked between his daughter and his brother-in-law, clearly torn between his genuine care for Eleanor and the mounting pressure of debts that threatened everything he had built. "I need time to consider this properly," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of an impossible decision. "Gerald, I will not make any promises to Lord Ashworth until I have explored every other option available to us." Gerald's frustration was evident, but he did not push further in that moment, instead departing with a curt reminder that time was not a luxury they could afford indefinitely. Once he had gone, Walter turned to his daughter, with visible exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I am sorry you had to hear that," he said quietly. "I have been trying to shield you from the severity of our circumstances, but it seems that effort has failed." Eleanor embraced her father, feeling the weight of his worry as though it were her own. "We will find another way, Father," she said, though privately she was not entirely certain such a way existed. Word of the family's financial troubles, and the whispered arrangement being proposed with Lord Ashworth, traveled through society circles faster than Eleanor could have anticipated, carried along the same channels of gossip that had once celebrated her brief connection to Duke Whitmore. It was through this same network of whispers that Alexander first learned of the situation, arriving at the news through Charles, who had heard it from his own family's connections within the merchant community. Alexander's reaction was immediate and fierce, a protective anger surging through him at the thought of Eleanor being forced into marriage with a man whose reputation for cruelty was well documented among those who paid attention to such matters. He made discreet inquiries of his own, confirming the details of the Hartley family's debt and the extent of Lord Ashworth's involvement, before deciding on a course of action that he kept entirely private, even from Charles. Working through an intermediary, a solicitor he trusted implicitly for his discretion, Alexander arranged to purchase the outstanding debt from the creditors pressuring Walter Hartley, structuring the transaction so that his own name never appeared in any of the paperwork. He instructed the solicitor to extend generous terms for repayment, terms far more favorable than anything Gerald Finch's arrangement with Lord Ashworth could have offered, and to present the offer as coming from an anonymous benefactor interested in supporting honest merchants facing temporary hardship. The offer arrived at the Hartley household within the week, delivered by the solicitor with careful explanations of terms that seemed almost too generous to believe. Walter read through the documents with growing disbelief, questioning the solicitor repeatedly about the identity of this mysterious benefactor, only to be told firmly that the client's wishes for anonymity were to be respected absolutely. "Whoever this person is, Walter said to Eleanor that evening, turning the papers over in his hands as though searching for some hidden clue. They have saved this family from a fate I dread to imagine. I do not understand why anyone would extend such generosity without expecting something in return. Eleanor studied the documents herself, noting details that seemed oddly familiar, though she could not immediately place why. She thought little more of it in the following days, relieved simply that the immediate threat of Lord Ashworth's proposal had been removed from consideration, allowing her family to breathe freely for the first time in weeks. It was Margaret who eventually uncovered the truth. Through a conversation with the acquaintance who worked within the same social circles that connected to Alexander's household staff. The particular solicitor named in the documents, her acquaintance mentioned casually, was known to handle matters exclusively for Duke Whitmore's private affairs. Margaret said nothing to Eleanor immediately, turning the information over carefully in her mind before deciding how best to share it. She finally approached her niece several days later, finding Eleanor in the garden with her sketchbook, and sat beside her with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to most difficult conversations. "I believe I know who arranged the settlement of your father's debt," Margaret said quietly. Eleanor looked up sharply, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "Who?" Margaret explained what she had learned, watching her niece's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something far more complicated as the pieces settled into place. Eleanor sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the enormity of what Alexander had done, quietly and without any expectation of recognition or gratitude. "He never said a word," Eleanor finally murmured, more to herself than to her aunt. "He simply arranged everything and let us believe it came from a stranger. That is precisely why it means something," Margaret observed gently. "A man seeking only to win your favor would have made certain you knew exactly who to thank. This man asked for nothing at all." Eleanor closed her sketchbook slowly, her mind racing through every interaction she had shared with Alexander since their first meeting at the ball, searching for any sign that might have suggested he was capable of such quiet, selfless generosity. She thought of his patience at the garden party, his genuine interest in her sketches, the way he had listened without judgment to the painful story of her sister's heartbreak. Every piece now fit together into a portrait of a man far different from the careless nobleman she had initially assumed him to be. For the first time since walking away from him at that first ball, Eleanor found herself wanting to seek him out rather than avoid him, though she remained uncertain what she would even say when she finally had the opportunity. The careful walls she had built around her heart, walls constructed from years of watching her sister's devastation, had begun to show their first genuine cracks, and she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to repair them. Meanwhile, Gerald Finch had not taken the sudden resolution of the debt with any grace. He arrived at the Hartley household 2 days after the settlement was finalized, his expression thunderous as he confronted Walter in the study. "You have thrown away a perfectly sound arrangement," he said sharply. "Lord Ashworth will not forget this insult easily, and you have made an enemy of a man with considerable influence, all because some anonymous stranger decided to play the generous benefactor." Walter remained calm despite his brother-in-law's agitation. "The debt is settled honorably, Gerald, and my daughter's future is no longer bound to a man whose reputation troubles me deeply. I fail to see how that outcome deserves your anger." Gerald's jaw tightened, and for a moment something colder flickered across his features, a hint that his interest in the Ashworth arrangement had perhaps extended beyond simple concern for the family's finances. "I had my own reasons for wanting that connection secured," he admitted grudgingly, though he offered no further explanation before gathering his coat and departing the house without another word. Eleanor, who had overheard the exchange from the hallway, felt a fresh wave of unease at her uncle's cryptic remark, wondering what personal stake he might have held in seeing her married off to a man like Lord Ashworth. She resolved to remain watchful of Gerald's future involvement in her family's affairs, sensing that his ambitions ran deeper than he had ever openly admitted. That evening, Eleanor sat with her aunt in the small parlor, the fire crackling softly as rain tapped against the windows. "I want to thank him properly," Eleanor said finally, breaking a long silence between them. "I cannot simply pretend I do not know what he did for my family." Margaret considered this carefully. "And how do you intend to do that, without causing the very scandal his anonymity was meant to avoid?" Eleanor had already turned the problem over in her mind many times. "Perhaps a letter," she suggested. "Something private, that acknowledges what I know without announcing it to the world. I owe him that much honesty, even if I say nothing more." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That seems a wise course. Though I suspect, my dear, that a letter will only be the beginning of whatever conversation still needs to happen between the two of you." Eleanor did not deny this, though she said nothing further, retreating instead to her room to draft and redraft the letter late into the night, searching for words that could properly convey gratitude without overstepping the careful distance she had maintained since their first meeting. She wrote of her family's relief, of her admiration for his discretion, and finally, after much hesitation, of her growing belief that perhaps she had misjudged how deeply a man of his position could care for someone outside his own circle. She sealed the letter before she could talk herself out of sending it, resolving to have it delivered to his estate the following morning, uncertain what response, if any, it might bring, but no longer willing to let his quiet kindness go unacknowledged. Across the city, Alexander received the letter 2 days later, recognizing Eleanor's careful handwriting on the envelope before he had even broken the seal. He read her words slowly, more than once, feeling something settle warmly in his chest that no amount of admiration from other women had ever managed to produce. He did not respond immediately, choosing instead to consider carefully how he might build upon this fragile new opening she had offered him, aware that the coming weeks would require the same patience and honesty that had brought them this far. Charles found him that afternoon still holding the letter, an unfamiliar softness in his friend's expression that told him more than words could have. "You have heard from Miss Hartley," he guessed, settling into a chair across from Alexander's desk. "She knows what I did for her family," Alexander admitted, setting the letter down carefully as though it might tear from careless handling. "She thanked me, and admitted she may have misjudged me." Charles smiled, genuinely pleased for his friend. "That is no small thing, coming from a woman as guarded as she has been. What will you do now?" Alexander considered the question seriously, aware that his answer would shape whatever came next between himself and Eleanor. "I will not press her," he said finally. "I have learned, slowly, that pursuing her too openly only strengthens her caution. I will simply continue to show her, through patience rather than persistence, that my regard for her is genuine and lasting." "That sounds remarkably mature for a man who once declared before an entire ballroom that he never chases anyone," Charles observed with a knowing grin. Alexander allowed himself a rare, quiet laugh. "Perhaps I have finally learned the difference between chasing someone and simply choosing to remain steady for someone worth waiting for," he replied. And for the first time since that declaration at the ball, the words felt entirely true. The whispers began quietly, as they always did, passed between fans and behind gloved hands at gatherings Alexander no longer attended alone. By the time the rumors reached his mother, the Dowager Duchess Whitmore, they had grown into something far more scandalous than the truth, suggesting that her son had secretly financed a merchant family's debts in exchange for the daughter's affections, or worse, that he intended to marry beneath his station entirely and disgrace the family name in the process. She summoned Alexander to her sitting room on a cold morning, her expression grave as she gestured for him to sit across from her. "I have heard troubling things, Alexander," she began without preamble. "People are saying you have entangled yourself with a merchant's daughter, that you paid off her family's debts, and that you have been seen with her at every gathering for weeks. Tell me none of this is true." Alexander met his mother's gaze steadily, refusing to look away or offer the easy denial she seemed to expect. "I did help settle the Hartley family's debts," he admitted plainly, "and I have sought Eleanor Hartley's company because I find her character admirable in ways I have not encountered in any other woman." The Duchess's face paled with a mixture of shock and disapproval. "Have you lost your senses entirely? A merchant's daughter, Alexander? Do you understand what this would mean for our family's standing, for the alliances we have carefully cultivated for generations? Your father built this family's reputation on strategic marriages and careful associations. You cannot simply discard all of that because a woman with no title has caught your fancy." "I have not decided upon marriage, mother," Alexander replied, though the words felt less certain than he wanted them to sound. "I have simply chosen to know her better, to understand a woman whose honesty I find more valuable than any title or fortune she might have brought instead." "Honesty does not pay for the upkeep of this estate," the Duchess said sharply. "Honesty does not secure political alliances or ensure our family's continued influence within society. I understand that infatuation can cloud a young man's judgment, but I expect you to remember your responsibilities before you allow this to progress any further." Alexander rose from his chair, his own frustration finally breaking through his usual composed demeanor. "I have spent my entire life fulfilling responsibilities that others defined for me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I have attended every gathering expected of me, cultivated every connection deemed necessary, and never once questioned whether the life laid out for me actually suited who I wished to become. Eleanor Hartley is the first person who has ever asked me to consider what I truly want, rather than what is expected of me." The Duchess studied her son for a long moment, clearly startled by the conviction in his voice, a conviction she had rarely witnessed from him on any matter. "This will bring scandal upon this family," she warned, though her tone had softened slightly, sensing perhaps that her usual arguments were losing their power against whatever had taken root in her son's heart. "Society will not easily forgive a duke who chooses a merchant's daughter over the proper alliances expected of his position. Then society will need to adjust its expectations," Alexander replied quietly, before excusing himself from the room, leaving his mother alone with concerns she was not yet ready to release. The gossip continued to spread despite Alexander's private resolve, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until it reached Eleanor's own circle of acquaintances, arriving in whispered fragments that left her deeply unsettled. She heard, secondhand through a friend who meant well but delivered the news with visible discomfort, that some in society believed she had deliberately schemed to trap a duke into supporting her family financially, using calculated indifference to draw out his interest before securing his assistance through manipulation. The accusation struck Eleanor with particular force, precisely because it inverted everything she believed about her own character. She had spent years guarding herself against exactly the kind of manipulation now being attributed to her, and the suggestion that her caution had been merely a performance designed to entrap a wealthy man left her both furious and deeply hurt. She confronted Alexander directly at the next gathering they both attended, finding him near the edge of a crowded drawing room and pulling him aside with an urgency that surprised him. "Do you understand what people are saying about me?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp with barely contained emotion. "They believe I schemed to trap you, that I manufactured my indifference deliberately to secure your assistance for my family. Everything I have built, every principle I have held on to since Charlotte's death, is being twisted into something ugly because of your involvement in my family's affairs." Alexander felt the accusation land with genuine pain, understanding immediately the depth of the injury he had inadvertently caused. "I never intended for you to suffer any consequence from what I did," he said earnestly. "I acted anonymously precisely to protect you from exactly this kind of speculation." "Anonymity rarely survives contact with society's appetite for gossip," Eleanor replied, her frustration evident despite her efforts to remain composed. "You should have known that, or at least considered it, before involving yourself in my family's private matters without my knowledge or consent." "You are angry that I helped your family," Alexander said slowly, working to understand the full shape of her distress. "I am angry that you made a decision that affected my entire reputation without ever asking whether I wanted your intervention," Eleanor clarified, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again, aware of the guests around them. "I understand your intentions were generous, Alexander, but generosity without consultation can cause as much harm as it prevents. You treated me as someone to be rescued, rather than someone capable of navigating my own family's difficulties." Her words struck him harder than any accusation from his mother had managed, precisely because he recognized the truth within them. He had acted from genuine care, but also, he realized now, from a desire to prove himself to her, to demonstrate his worth through grand gesture rather than patient partnership. "I did not consider it from that perspective," he admitted quietly. "I saw a danger to your family and acted to remove it, without pausing to consider how that action might affect you beyond the immediate crisis." Eleanor's expression remained guarded, though something in her posture softened slightly at his honest admission. "That is precisely the problem," she said, her voice quieter now. "You are accustomed to solving problems through wealth and influence, deciding what is best and acting upon it, because your position has always allowed you that freedom. I am not accustomed to having decisions made on my behalf, regardless of how well-intentioned they might be." Alexander absorbed her words fully, recognizing the deeper pattern she was describing, one that extended beyond this single incident to the fundamental difference in how they each moved through the world. "I am sorry," he said finally, and the simplicity of the apology carried more weight than any elaborate justification could have offered. "I will not pretend I regret helping your family avoid a fate with Lord Ashworth, but I do regret not considering how my methods might cost you something I failed to anticipate. If given the chance, I would ask you first, before acting, and respect whatever answer you gave me." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his expression for the sincerity she had learned, slowly and reluctantly, to recognize in him. "The gossip will fade eventually," she said finally, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "It always does, once something new captures society's attention. But I need you to understand that I cannot build anything with you, Alexander, if it requires me to become someone who is managed and protected, rather than someone who is genuinely partnered with and respected." "I understand," Alexander said firmly. "And I want exactly that. A partnership built on respect rather than protection alone." I have spent these past weeks trying to prove myself worthy of your trust through grand gestures, when perhaps what you have needed all along is simply honesty and consultation." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of other guests, forcing them to separate before either could fully resolve the tension that had surfaced between them. Yet something had shifted in the exchange, a deeper understanding forged through conflict rather than avoided by it, and both of them carried the weight of that understanding through the remainder of the evening's festivities. Later that night, alone in his study, Alexander reflected on his mother's warnings and Eleanor's justified anger, recognizing that he stood at a genuine crossroads. He could retreat from this pursuit entirely, avoiding the scandal his mother feared and the complications Eleanor's confrontation had revealed, returning to the comfortable, predictable life he had known before that first ball. Or he could commit fully to whatever future might exist with Eleanor, accepting the scandal, the disapproval, and the genuine work required to build the kind of respectful partnership she demanded, rather than the grand but ultimately hollow gestures he had defaulted to thus far. He thought of Charlotte's story, of the nobleman who had chosen his family's approval over genuine love, abandoning a woman who had trusted him completely. He thought of his own declaration at that first ball, the confident assertion that he never chased anyone, and understood now how thoroughly that certainty had already crumbled beneath the weight of what he felt for Eleanor. The question was no longer whether he wanted her, a truth he had accepted weeks earlier, but whether he possessed the courage to choose her fully, publicly, and permanently, regardless of the cost to his family's expectations or society's judgment. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned home carrying her own uncertainty, torn between the anger she had rightfully expressed and the undeniable sincerity she had witnessed in Alexander's response to her confrontation. She had spent years building walls to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, yet here she stood, genuinely considering whether a duke's promises of partnership and respect might prove different from the empty promises that had destroyed her sister. She did not yet know the answer, but for the first time she found herself willing to remain open to discovering it, rather than retreating immediately into the safety of her guarded caution. The following days passed with a strange, charged distance between them, both aware that their next encounter would likely determine the trajectory of whatever connection had grown between them since that first declaration at the ball. Gerald Finch, sensing an opportunity in the lingering scandal surrounding Eleanor's reputation, attempted once more to press his sister's family toward alternative arrangements, suggesting that the damage to Eleanor's standing might require a hasty, quiet marriage to salvage what remained of her prospects. Walter refused firmly this time, having witnessed his daughter's strength and clarity throughout the ordeal, trusting her judgment over his brother-in-law's persistent scheming. Eleanor, for her part, found herself drawn increasingly toward a decision she had never expected to face, weighing years of careful self-protection against the growing, undeniable pull of genuine feeling for a man who had proven himself willing to be corrected, to apologize sincerely, and to reconsider his own assumptions rather than simply insisting upon his own way. It was a quality she had not expected to find in a man of his position, and it complicated every certainty she had built her life around since Charlotte's death had taught her to trust no promise that wealth and title could offer. The matter came to a head sooner than either of them expected, at a musical evening hosted by a family long acquainted with the Whitmore household. Eleanor arrived with her aunt, hoping the smaller, quieter gathering might offer some respite from the whispers that had followed her through every recent event. Instead, she found herself seated near a cluster of women whose conversation grew pointedly louder as she settled into her chair, their words clearly aimed for her benefit despite their pretense of private discussion. "It is remarkable," one woman remarked to her companion, not troubling to lower her voice, "how quickly some families rise above their station when a convenient debt happens to be settled by a generous stranger. One almost wonders what services were rendered in exchange for such generosity." Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, humiliation and anger warring within her, as the implication landed with cruel precision. Her aunt stiffened beside her, opening her mouth to respond, but Eleanor placed a steadying hand on Margaret's arm, unwilling to give the gossiping women the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Across the room, Alexander had heard the remark as well, his jaw tightening as he set down his glass and crossed the space between them with deliberate, unhurried steps that nonetheless carried an unmistakable intensity. He positioned himself near Eleanor, close enough that his presence alone silenced the offending conversation, and addressed the assembled group with a coldness few had ever witnessed from him. "I would be careful with such speculation," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that left no doubt as to his displeasure. "Miss Hartley's family faced a difficult circumstance, and I chose, of my own will and for reasons that concern no one but myself, to assist them, If anyone here wishes to question my judgment, I invite them to do so directly, rather than hiding behind insinuations aimed at a woman who has done nothing to deserve such treatment." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the offending women exchanging embarrassed glances before offering hurried, insincere apologies and retreating toward the refreshment table. Eleanor sat frozen for a moment, torn between gratitude for his defense and a familiar discomfort at being so publicly rescued, a tension that had defined their entire relationship since the debt had first been settled. Once the immediate crowd had dispersed, Eleanor rose and walked toward the terrace doors, needing air and space to process the swirl of emotions the encounter had stirred. Alexander followed a moment later, finding her standing at the balustrade overlooking the darkened garden below. "Thank you for defending me," she said without turning around, her voice carefully controlled. "But I fear your intervention will only add fuel to the very rumors you were trying to silence." "I could not simply stand by while they spoke of you that way," Alexander replied, moving to stand beside her. "Whatever consequences follow, I do not regret defending your honor." Eleanor finally turned to face him, her expression a complicated mixture of frustration and something softer beneath it. "I do not need to be rescued, Alexander," she said quietly. "I have survived worse than a few cruel women whispering behind fans. What I need is for you to understand that every time you step in to protect me, publicly or otherwise, you deepen the very scandal we are both trying to navigate, and you make it harder for people to believe that whatever exists between us is genuine, rather than some elaborate arrangement." "Then tell me what you want me to do," Alexander said, an unfamiliar helplessness entering his voice. "I cannot simply stand silent while you are insulted in front of me, yet you tell me my defense only worsens matters. I do not know how to protect you without protecting you, Eleanor." Eleanor's expression softened further at the genuine confusion in his voice, recognizing that he was not performing frustration, but truly grappling with a problem that had no easy solution. "Perhaps," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "the answer is not for you to stop defending me, but for us to stop pretending there is nothing here worth defending. The whispers exist because everyone can sense something is happening between us, yet neither of us has been honest enough, publicly, to give that something a proper name. Perhaps the secrecy itself is what invites such cruel speculation." Alexander studied her carefully, understanding the weight of what she was suggesting. "You are saying the solution is not less involvement, but more honesty about what this involvement actually is," he said slowly. Eleanor nodded, though a flicker of fear crossed her expression at the vulnerability of what she was proposing. "I am saying that if there is something real here, Alexander, it deserves to be acknowledged honestly rather than protected through anonymous gestures and private confrontations that only fuel further gossip. I am tired of hiding from a truth I am no longer certain I wish to hide from." The admission hung between them in the cool evening air, heavier and more significant than anything either had said since that first sharp exchange at the ball months earlier. Alexander felt something settle firmly into place within his chest, a clarity he had been circling for weeks finally crystallizing into certainty. "Then let us stop hiding," he said quietly, and the words carried the weight of a decision rather than a mere suggestion. Word spread through the household staff before it ever reached the wider circles of society, the kind of news that servants carried between kitchens and stables faster than any formal announcement could travel. Duke Whitmore had requested a grand ball at his own estate, an event unlike anything he had hosted in years, and he had personally overseen every detail of the preparations with an attentiveness that left his household staff both baffled and quietly delighted. Alexander's mother, upon learning of his plans, arrived at his study demanding an explanation, though the set of her shoulders suggested she already suspected the answer. "You intend to make some kind of announcement," she said, less a question than a resigned observation, "about the Hartley girl." "I intend to stop hiding what I feel for her," Alexander confirmed, meeting his mother's gaze without hesitation. "I have spent weeks trying to protect her through anonymous gestures and quiet interventions, and it has only invited more scandal, not less. Eleanor deserves better than whispered rumors and half-truths. She deserves an honest acknowledgement, made publicly, so that no one can question the nature of my regard for her ever again." The Duchess studied her son for a long moment, searching his face for the impulsive infatuation she had assumed drove his earlier behavior, and finding instead a settled conviction that unsettled her more than any youthful passion could have. "You are prepared to face whatever consequences follow," she said slowly. "The families who will withdraw their alliances, the friends who will distance themselves, the years of careful positioning that will need rebuilding from an entirely different foundation." "I am prepared," Alexander said firmly. I have spent my entire life fulfilling obligations that others defined for me, exactly as I told you weeks ago. This is the first choice I have made entirely for myself, and I do not intend to abandon it because the cost proves higher than I anticipated." The Duchess was silent for a long moment, something shifting behind her composed expression. "Your father once told me something similar," she finally admitted, her voice softer than Alexander had heard it in years. "Before we married, his own family opposed the match, believing my family's fortune insufficient to justify the alliance. He told them, much as you have told me, that he had made his choice and would bear whatever consequences followed. I had forgotten that story until this very moment." Alexander watched his mother's expression shift from resistance toward something more contemplative. "If that is true," he said carefully, "then perhaps you understand better than anyone why I cannot simply set this aside for the sake of convenient alliances." The Duchess did not offer full approval, not yet, but she nodded slowly, a small concession that Alexander recognized as significant progress nonetheless. "I will attend your ball," she said finally. "I make no promises beyond that, but I will attend, and I will observe this woman who has apparently changed my son so thoroughly. That is all I ask," Alexander replied, genuine relief evident in his voice for the first time since the conversation had begun. Meanwhile, Eleanor received the invitation to the Whitmore ball with a mixture of anticipation and dread that kept her awake through most of the preceding night. She understood, without needing to be told explicitly, that this event would likely determine the course of everything that had developed between herself and Alexander since that first sharp exchange months earlier. Margaret helped her prepare a gown for the occasion, a deep blue fabric that complemented her coloring without the ostentatious display favored by many of the other guests likely to attend. "You look beautiful," Margaret said as she fastened the final clasps, studying her niece's reflection in the mirror with evident pride. "Charlotte would be proud of the woman you have become, strong enough to guard your heart when necessary, and brave enough to open it again when the moment finally proved right." Eleanor's eyes glistened briefly at the mention of her sister, though she blinked back the emotion, drawing strength from her aunt's words rather than allowing them to overwhelm her composure. "I hope I am making the right choice," she admitted quietly. "I have spent so many years certain that men like Alexander could never be trusted, and now I find myself walking into his home, prepared to acknowledge feelings I have fought against since the moment we met." "You are not making a foolish choice," Margaret assured her firmly. "You have watched him carefully these past months, tested his sincerity through conflict and honest confrontation rather than blind faith. That is precisely the caution Charlotte lacked, and precisely why I believe you are walking into this evening with clearer eyes than she ever possessed." The words settled something within Eleanor, steadying her nerves as the carriage arrived to carry her toward the Whitmore estate. The grand house blazed with candlelight as they approached, music and laughter spilling out through open windows into the cool evening air, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken as she stepped from the carriage and crossed the threshold into a world she had once believed entirely closed to someone of her circumstances. Alexander spotted her almost immediately upon her arrival, having positioned himself near the entrance specifically to greet her before the evening's formalities could separate them within the crowd. He crossed the room with purposeful steps, ignoring the curious glances that followed his movement, and extended his hand toward her with a warmth that carried none of the careful restraint that had characterized their earlier public interactions. "You came," he said simply, though the relief in his voice suggested he had genuinely feared she might not. "I told you I was tired of hiding," Eleanor replied, accepting his hand and allowing him to lead her further into the ballroom, past clusters of curious guests whose whispered speculation followed their every step. The evening progressed through its usual formalities, dinner and conversation and the careful choreography of a society gathering, though an undercurrent of anticipation ran through the entire event, every guest sensing that something significant was building toward its inevitable revelation. Alexander remained close to Eleanor throughout, no longer troubling to maintain the careful distance that propriety typically demanded, and by the time the orchestra began the evening's central dance, few among the assembled guests doubted the nature of the connection between them. As the music reached its natural pause, Alexander requested silence from the orchestra and stepped forward, raising his voice to address the full assembly of guests who had gathered in his home that evening. The room quieted gradually, curious murmurs fading into attentive silence as every eye turned toward the Duke. "Many of you have heard rumors these past weeks," he began, his voice steady despite the significance of what he was about to say. "Rumors about my involvement with Miss Eleanor Hartley, about the assistance I provided her family, and about the nature of my regard for her. I have allowed those rumors to circulate without correction for too long, hoping that discretion would protect her from scrutiny. I understand now that discretion accomplished the opposite, inviting speculation that has caused her genuine pain. He turned to find Eleanor's eyes across the room, holding her gaze as he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. So I will simply tell you the truth. I helped Eleanor's family because I care for her, deeply and genuinely, not as some passing amusement but as a woman whose honesty and character have changed how I understand my own life. Months ago, I stood in a ballroom much like this one and declared, with great confidence, that I never chase anyone. I have since learned how thoroughly wrong that declaration was. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the crowd, though Alexander continued without pause, his attention fixed entirely on Eleanor as she stood frozen near the edge of the gathering, her heart pounding at the public nature of his declaration. I chased Eleanor Hartley, he continued, a faint smile touching his lips despite the gravity of the moment. I chased her through garden parties and formal dinners, through her justified anger and her careful caution, through every obstacle her guarded heart placed before me. I do not regret a single moment of that pursuit, and I intend to continue it for the rest of my life, if she will permit me the honor. He crossed the room toward her then, ignoring the astonished whispers that followed his movement, and knelt before her in full view of every guest assembled in his grand ballroom. Eleanor Hartley, he said, his voice carrying the same sincerity that had first begun to dismantle her careful defenses months earlier, I am asking you, publicly and without any doubt as to my intentions, to marry me, not because your family requires rescue, not because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life without your honesty, your strength, and your presence beside me. Eleanor stood in stunned silence for a long moment, the weight of the entire room's attention pressing upon her alongside the enormity of what he was asking. She thought of Charlotte, of the caution that had guarded her heart so carefully for years, and of the genuine, tested sincerity that had slowly, patiently earned its way past every defense she had constructed. She thought of his willingness to be corrected, to apologize, to reconsider his own assumptions, qualities she had never expected to find in a man of his position, yet had witnessed repeatedly throughout their months of careful courtship. Yes, she said finally, her voice clear and certain despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I will marry you, Alexander. The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Alexander rose and drew Eleanor into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any further words could have managed. Even the Duchess, watching from across the room, found herself smiling despite her earlier reservations, recognizing in her son's expression a genuine happiness she had not witnessed in years. Charles Ellery approached the couple once the initial excitement had settled slightly, unable to resist a final teasing remark, despite the emotion of the moment. So the Duke, who never chases anyone, has just proposed marriage in front of the entire county, he observed with evident delight. I believe that officially makes you the greatest chaser in London society, my friend. Alexander laughed, genuinely and without restraint, an expression of pure happiness that few in the room had ever witnessed from him. I never chase anyone, he repeated, echoing his own long-forgotten declaration, until I met someone worth chasing for the rest of my life. Eleanor, standing beside him with her hand held firmly in his, felt the last remnants of her careful guardedness settle into something new, not the absence of caution entirely, but a trust earned through patience, honesty, and genuine partnership rather than empty promises. She thought of her sister one final time, silently promising Charlotte that her caution had not been wasted, but had instead led her toward exactly the kind of love that had once been so cruelly denied to someone she had loved so completely. As the music resumed and the evening celebration continued around them, Alexander leaned close to whisper words meant only for Eleanor, a private promise beneath the public celebration of their engagement. Whatever comes next, he said quietly, we will face it together, honestly and as equals, exactly as you deserve. Eleanor smiled up at him, the last of her doubts finally settling into peaceful certainty. That is all I ever wanted, she replied, and as they moved together back into the celebration of the ball, both of them understood that whatever challenges society or family might yet present, they would face them from a foundation built not on grand gestures or empty declarations, but on the patient, honest partnership that had slowly transformed a Duke's careless confidence into a love worth chasing for the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, the news of their engagement traveled through society exactly as Alexander's mother had predicted, drawing both fascination and disapproval in nearly equal measure. Some families did indeed withdraw their invitations, whispering that the Whitmore name had been diminished by such an unconventional match. Others, intrigued by the sheer romance of a Duke's public declaration, found themselves newly curious about the woman who had captured his attention so completely, and Eleanor discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that many drawing rooms which had once excluded her now sought her company eagerly. Gerald Finch made one final attempt to insert himself into the family's newly elevated circumstances, arriving at the Hartley household with congratulations that rang hollow against his earlier scheming. Walter received him politely but firmly, making clear that his brother-in-law's influence over the family's affairs had ended the moment he prioritized his own ambitions over his niece's well-being. Gerald departed without argument, sensing correctly that his opportunities within the family had closed permanently, and Eleanor felt no small measure of relief at watching him go. The wedding itself took place on a bright morning in early autumn, held at the small chapel near Alexander's estate rather than the grand cathedral his mother had initially proposed, a compromise that reflected the values Eleanor had brought into their partnership from the very beginning. She wore a simple gown, elegant without excess, much as she had at that very first ball where Alexander had declared, with such misguided confidence, that he never chased anyone. Margaret sat in the front pew, dabbing at tears she made no effort to hide, while the Dowager Duchess, seated beside her, found herself surprised by the genuine warmth she felt toward the woman her son had chosen, warmth that had grown steadily through months of careful observation and honest conversation between the two women. Charles Ellery stood beside Alexander as his closest friend and witness, unable to resist one final whispered joke about the great chase finally reaching its destination, though even his teasing carried genuine affection rather than mockery. As Eleanor walked toward Alexander at the altar, she thought briefly of Charlotte, of the sister whose heartbreak had taught her such careful caution, and felt a quiet certainty that her sister would have approved of the patient, tested love she had finally allowed herself to accept. Alexander watched her approach with an expression of open, unguarded joy that erased any lingering doubt from those who had once questioned his sincerity. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, promises built not on grand declarations but on the quiet truths that had defined their courtship from its very beginning: honesty over performance, partnership over protection, and patience over empty promise. When Alexander finally kissed his bride before their assembled family and friends, the applause that followed carried none of the scandalized whispers that had once trailed their courtship, replaced instead by genuine celebration for a love that had proven, through every test and confrontation, to be exactly as real as it had first appeared on that unlikely night at the ball. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had met, Alexander would tell the story with a warm, self-deprecating laugh, describing how he had once stood before an entire ballroom and declared that he never chased anyone, only to spend the following months proving himself entirely wrong. Eleanor would add, with the same quiet honesty that had first drawn him to her, that she had walked away from him that first night, fully expecting never to think of him again, and that she had been wrong about that as well. Between them, the story had become not a tale of a duke's careless pride, but of two guarded hearts who had slowly, patiently, and honestly taught each other how to trust again. Lord Ashworth learned of Eleanor's engagement to Duke Whitmore through the same gossip networks that had once carried whispers of his own failed pursuit of her, and the news struck him with an anger he made little effort to conceal. He had never forgiven the quiet collapse of Gerald Finch's arrangement, viewing it as a personal insult rather than simply a business matter left unresolved. At a hunting gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance some months after the wedding, he cornered Alexander near the stables, his expression carrying the same coldness that had made his reputation so troubling among those who knew him best. "You believe yourself quite clever," Ashworth said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention from the other guests. "Stealing a bride from beneath my arrangement and parading her through society as though you have done something admirable." Alexander regarded him evenly, refusing to be baited into the kind of confrontation Ashworth seemed to be seeking. "There was no arrangement to steal," he replied calmly. "Eleanor was never yours to claim, and her family's debt was never yours to leverage against her future. I simply ensured she retained the freedom to choose her own path, which she did, quite happily, without any consideration of you at all." Ashworth's jaw tightened at the dismissal, and for a moment something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, the same quality that had earned him his troubling reputation among former acquaintances and dismissed servants alike. "You will regret making an enemy of me," he said quietly, before turning and stalking away without further conversation. Alexander mentioned the encounter to Eleanor that evening, not wishing to keep secrets from her as he once might have, and watched her expression shift from concern to a steady, settled resolve. "He has no power over us any longer," she said firmly. "Whatever bitterness he carries is his own burden, not one we need accept into our lives." She proved correct in the months that followed, as Ashworth's own reputation continued its slow decline through further incidents of cruelty toward those in his employ, eventually resulting in his quiet withdrawal from the more prominent social circles that had once tolerated his behavior, despite the whispered warnings that followed him. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a settled relief that her family's earlier brush with his intentions had ended exactly as it should have, with her freedom intact and her family's honor preserved. As the first year of their marriage progressed, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn toward charitable work supporting young women in circumstances similar to her sisters, establishing a small but growing initiative that provided guidance and resources to women navigating courtships with men of higher social standing, offering practical counsel on recognizing genuine character beneath practiced charm. Alexander supported the endeavor fully, using his own connections to secure resources and legitimacy for the initiative that Eleanor's more modest standing alone could not have provided. The work brought Eleanor a sense of purpose beyond her role as Alexander's wife, a purpose that honored Charlotte's memory in ways more meaningful than grief alone could have accomplished. She met regularly with young women uncertain how to distinguish genuine affection from calculated pursuit, sharing her own hard-won wisdom about patience, honest confrontation, and the importance of testing character through conflict rather than accepting comfortable performance at face value. One such young woman, a merchant's daughter named Clara Bennett who had recently caught the attention of a wealthy suitor, came to Eleanor deeply uncertain about how to proceed. "He says all the right things," Clara admitted during one of their private conversations, "but I do not know how to tell whether his words carry real weight behind them." Eleanor considered the question carefully, drawing on her own experience with the same uncertainty she had once felt toward Alexander. "Watch what he does when circumstances turn difficult," she advised. "Anyone can speak beautifully during pleasant moments. The truth of a person reveals itself in how they respond to conflict, to inconvenience, to moments when the easy path and the honest path diverge. Ask him hard questions, and pay attention not only to his answers, but to whether he is willing to be corrected when he gets something wrong." Clara took the advice to heart, and months later returned to share that her own courtship had weathered exactly the kind of honest testing Eleanor had described, resulting in a marriage built on foundations far sturdier than the initial charm that had first caught her attention. Eleanor found deep satisfaction in these small victories, each one a quiet tribute to the sister whose story had first taught her the value of such careful discernment. Alexander's mother, meanwhile, continued her gradual transformation, from skeptical resistance to genuine warmth, finding herself increasingly involved in Eleanor's charitable initiatives, despite her initial reservations about the entire courtship. She discovered, through months of working alongside her daughter-in-law, a shared commitment to honesty and integrity that ultimately mattered more to her than the social standing she had once considered paramount. The two women developed a genuine friendship that neither had anticipated, bonded by their shared devotion to Alexander's happiness and their mutual respect for the values Eleanor had brought into the family. The birth of Alexander and Eleanor's first child, a daughter they named after Charlotte, marked another significant turning point in their story, cementing the family's happiness in ways that silenced even the last remaining whispers of scandal from their unconventional courtship. Alexander proved himself as devoted a father as he had been a husband, present and attentive in ways that surprised those who remembered the confident, somewhat detached Duke who had once declared before an entire ballroom that he never chased anyone. Watching him hold their daughter for the first time, Eleanor felt the final, complete resolution of the caution that had once governed her every interaction with men of his standing. She thought of Charlotte, of the promise she had made silently at her own wedding, and felt certain, finally and completely, that her sister's memory had been honored not through continued grief, but through the genuine, tested happiness Eleanor had built with a man who had proven himself worthy of the trust she had once sworn never to extend again. Years later, their family had grown to include 2 more children, and their household had become known throughout society not for scandal, but for the genuine warmth and honesty that characterized every gathering held within its walls. Charles Ellery remained a constant presence in their lives, godfather to their eldest daughter, and never tired of reminding Alexander, at every opportunity, of the ballroom declaration that had begun their entire story. "You still owe me acknowledgement," Charles would say with his familiar grin, "that I predicted your downfall the very night you claimed you never chase anyone." Alexander would simply laugh, drawing Eleanor close beside him, and admit freely that he had never been more grateful for any prediction proving true. The Duke, who once prided himself on remaining unmoved by any woman's attention, had found, in the end, that the greatest pride of his life came not from resisting pursuit, but from the patient, honest chase that had finally won him a partnership worth every difficulty it had required. and a love that had transformed not only his own life, but the lives of every young woman who found courage in Eleanor's story to demand the same honesty for themselves. Margaret remained a constant presence in the growing family's life, taking particular delight in her role as great aunt to Eleanor's children, though she never fully relinquished her habit of offering quiet, thoughtful counsel whenever Eleanor faced a difficult decision. When Walter's trading business faced another setback several years into the marriage, this time from a genuine downturn in overseas markets rather than any scheme or misfortune, Eleanor found herself grateful for a different kind of support than she had once needed. Alexander offered assistance immediately, but this time the conversation unfolded entirely differently than it had during the crisis with Lord Ashworth years earlier. He came to Eleanor first, laying out the situation plainly rather than acting unilaterally, and asked how she believed they should proceed. "I could simply resolve this quietly, as I did before," he said, "but I have learned that such gestures, however well-intentioned, are not truly mine to make alone when they touch your family so directly." Eleanor appreciated the change deeply, recognizing in his careful consultation the fruit of lessons learned through their earlier conflict. They approached her father together, offering support structured as a genuine partnership rather than a rescue, allowing Walter to maintain his dignity and his ownership over the business he had built through years of honest effort. The arrangement strengthened rather than diminished the family's bond, precisely because it honored the principle Eleanor had fought so hard to establish at the very beginning of their courtship, that respect and consultation mattered more than grand, unilateral gestures, however generously intended. The business recovered within 2 years, aided by Walter's own renewed connections and the steady, patient guidance Alexander offered, without ever overstepping the boundaries Eleanor had helped him understand so clearly. Watching her father rebuild his enterprise with dignity intact, Eleanor felt a quiet pride that surpassed even the relief she had once felt at Lord Ashworth's threat being removed years earlier, because this time, the solution had honored everyone involved, rather than simply protecting her from harm. As their children grew older, Eleanor made a point of sharing Charlotte's story with them when they were old enough to understand its full weight, not as a tale of tragedy alone, but as a lesson in the importance of recognizing genuine character beneath surface charm. Their eldest daughter, upon hearing the story for the first time, asked her mother how she had known, finally, that her father was different from the man who had broken Charlotte's heart so completely. Eleanor considered the question carefully, exactly as she considered most things, before answering with the same honesty that had defined her entire courtship. "I did not know immediately," she admitted. "I doubted him for a long while, and I tested him more than once, through anger and confrontation and demands that many men would have found tiresome or unworthy of their patience. Your father proved himself not through grand words alone, but through his willingness to be corrected, to listen when I told him he had made a mistake, and to change his approach rather than simply insisting he knew best. That is how you will know, my darling, when the time comes for you to trust someone with your own heart." Alexander, listening from the doorway, felt a familiar warmth settle through him at his wife's words, understanding fully now, after years of partnership, exactly what she had seen in him that first night at the ball when he had so confidently declared that he never chased anyone. He had chased her, honestly and imperfectly, through every obstacle her guarded heart had placed before him, and in doing so, had discovered a version of himself far more worthy of genuine love than the careless, confident Duke who had first caught her eye across a crowded ballroom. Their story, told and retold throughout society over the following years, became something of a quiet legend among those who valued genuine partnership over convenient arrangement, a reminder that even the most guarded hearts could learn to trust again, given patience, honesty, and a love willing to prove itself through action rather than mere declaration.